Number 5 on this list is the exorcism of Kennedy Ife. Kennedy Ife was a 26-year-old man who reportedly became possessed by a demon. It started when he got an unexplained pain in his throat and then began to act very strange. He complained that there was a python inside of him and it forced him to bite his own father. He even threatened to cut off his own before his family strapped him to his bed and tied him down. His brother later said to the police that it's clear that this thing was in him. What we believed was a demon because it was not natural. It was clearly trying to kill him. Kennedy did sadly die, however it wasn't at the hands of a demon, but actually by his own family. Kennedy had been tied to his bed for 3 days before his brother called for medical help. He was extremely dehydrated and developed breathing problems as he was lying there. When the paramedics got there, they pronounced him dead at the scene. The family had attempted to exorcise this demon out of Kennedy through prayer and extensive force. Kennedy's body had been battered through this exorcism as the family attempted to cure his soul. They were eventually all charged with manslaughter, however the jury found them not guilty in court and they were set free. Personally, I can't even imagine how brutal it would have been to be strapped to a bed for 3 days straight, getting beaten and slowly dehydrating. Truly a horrible way to die. Number 4 on this list is Fyodor Laxman. Fyodor Laxman was a Russian farmer in the early 1800s. For a long time, Fyodor had been in disputes with one of his close neighbors for farmland. They had developed a deep hatred for one another and would often sabotage each other's crops. Laxman eventually reached a breaking point after another blow from his neighbor and ended the dispute once and for all by murdering him and his family as they slept. A season passed and Laxman and his family prospered with the new land and their abundance of crops. However, during this time, something began happening in their home. The family felt unwanted there and signs of a demonic presence could be seen. After a while, the wife couldn't stand it anymore and she demanded that they have an exorcist come look at their home. They managed to find an exorcist several villages over to come and take a look at their house. He set up his supplies and was going to perform a ritual to cleanse the house of any demonic presence. When he began the ritual though, that demonic presence finally made itself abundantly clear. A shadow figure erupted from the wall and forced itself into Fyodor's body. It looked like a ghost had immediately entered his soul and taken all control of his actions. Fyodor's eyes went immediately bloodshot and he turned to his shocked wife and said the words, "You take from me, I take from you." Then he reached out his hands and before the exorcist could stop him, strangled his own wife in front of his children, killing her where she stood. Right as her body fell to the floor, his did as well, devoid of life. A minute later, he started to slowly rouse himself and after seeing what he had done, broke into a deep sob. He knew that the ghost of his dead neighbor had haunted them and now Fyodor was forced to live with the fact that he killed his own wife with his bare hands. Number 3 on this list is the exorcism of Beatrice Clement. Beatrice Clement was a young woman who was said to have lived in the 9th century. She was a mother of 2 children and her husband was a butcher. At about the time she turned 30 years old, she started to experience episodes. These were episodes of psychosis that would be accompanied by deep hallucinations. It became increasingly apparent that her mental state was draining and the reality that she thought she lived in was far different than the truth. As with many other things back then, these episodes were chalked up to the work of the devil. Her husband, her children, her neighbors, everybody believed that a demon was in charge of her soul at this point. This obviously meant that an exorcism was in order. An exorcist was brought into Beatrice's home and was intended to eradicate the demon from her soul. The methods of these exorcisms were brutal though. It often involved Beatrice withholding food and water and other means of torture that were ultimately ineffective at getting rid of the demon. This went on for several weeks until it became increasingly clear that it wasn't working how they intended. One evening, Beatrice snuck out of her home and decided to take her own life. She couldn't manage to make it through one more exorcism, but truly believed in her soul that she was a danger to society in her present state. The sad thing about this whole story is that she most likely wasn't possessed by a demon at all. Some form of mental illness manifested itself in her and sadly led to her death months later. Number 2 on this list is the exorcisms of Saint Guthlec. He's often referred to as Saint Anthony the Great in Orthodox Christianity and is one of the greatest hermit saints of the early English church. He was born in 673 and was very attractive to demons. I found a passage that would actually describe these demons and I'm going to read that out now. They were ferocious in appearance, terrible in shape with great heads, long necks, thin faces, yellow complexions, filthy beards, shaggy ears, wild foreheads, fierce eyes, foul mouths, horses' teeth, throats vomiting flames, twisted jaws, thick lips, strident voices, singed hair, fat cheeks, pigeon's breast, scabby thighs, knotty knees, crooked legs, swollen ankles, splay feet, spreading mouths, raucous cries. For they grew so terrible to hear with their mighty shriekings that they filled almost the whole intervening space between earth and heaven with their discordant bellowings. That's the passage, and even though that's some pretty bad stuff, and they would actually go on to beat him with iron bars, he claimed that he wasn't afraid of these demons. That being said though, he did realize that they had to go. Guthix was actually approached by the holy apostle Bartholomew and given a whip. This whip was what he used to eradicate the demons from himself and ultimately become one of the most famous exorcists. A famous tale from St. Guthix was an exorcism that he performed on a man named Ecke. Ecke was deeply possessed by a demon and required the help of Guthix. Daniel Esperanza, an expert on the subject, writes, Guthix took off his belt, wrapped it around Ecke's waist, and squeezed it until the demon was breathed out. That means, guys, that during this exorcism, Ecke literally threw up a demon. I personally cannot imagine how horrible that would have been to get squeezed so hard that you throw up a demon. I suppose it's actions like that which have made St. Guthix's name live forever. Number 1 on this list is the exorcism of Fenton Lambert. Fenton Lambert was a 64-year-old man when he had his exorcism done to him. He lived in the 1700s and was a common worker. He had a wife and they had a son. However, their son died at a young age from disease. Fenton was a religious man and regularly went to church and prayed. He believed in God and knew in his heart that he was looking out for their best interests. His wife wasn't nearly as devout though. After the death of their son, she went into a deep depression and couldn't understand how God could possibly let their child die like that. Fenton tried to convince her that she needed to remain faithful, but knew that she never fully bought into that way of life again. One thing he wasn't aware of though, was how far she'd went in the other direction. One evening he woke up to find his wife staring over top of him. He was laying on the bed and he was tied down so that he couldn't move. He squirmed and tried to protest, but his wife wasn't having any of it. He could see that by the look in her eyes she was clearly not connected to reality anymore. She started to chant some demonic ritual of some kind, words that Fenton had never heard come from her mouth before. Then his wife procured a knife and brought it to Fenton's chest. She continued her chant and then began cutting into him, not deep enough to kill, but enough to cause a serious laceration. Fenton was squirming as much as he could, and through his struggling, got his left hand free. He hit his wife to the ground and quickly freed his other hand before she could get back to him. Recovered from the hit, she jumped on him and tried to get him back into his restraints. The pair tussled until Fenton once again threw her to the ground, where she stumbled and landed on her knife. She proceeded to slowly bleed out in front of her husband's eyes. Days later, he found her journal in the home and saw that she'd been planning to perform an exorcism on him for months. In this instance though, the one performing the exorcism was very clearly the one possessed by something sinister.
Coming in at number 5, we've got the Exorcism of Roland Doe. This is a famous one. Even if you haven't heard of Roland himself, you've heard of the works he's inspired. We all know of William Friedkin's Oscar-winning movie The Exorcist, right? Well, that was based on a book of the same title written by William Peter Blatty, which in turn was inspired by claims surrounding the exorcism of Roland Doe. It took a while, but this story made it into the homes of horror fans around the world. Back in the 1940s, priests of the Roman Catholic Church caught wind of a victim of demonic possession. The victim was a 14-year-old boy under the pseudonym of Roland Doe. Some say that the alias Robbie Mannheim was used as well. Either way, he underwent a series of exorcisms performed by different priests. First, a Lutheran pastor who claimed that he saw furniture moving around by itself. After witnessing this, he recommended the boy's parents reach out to a Catholic priest. Thus began a procession of priests coming through and attempting to remove demons from poor Roland. During these exorcisms, many strange things happened. Roland managed to snag a bed spring and use it as a weapon, slashing the attending priest. Another pair of priests claimed to see a shaking bed and flying objects, along with the boy speaking in a demonic voice and avoiding sacred objects with all his might. The final exorcism saw Roland break the nose of the priests trying to assist him. Thankfully, after this incident, Roland went on to live a normal and largely undemonic life. After all the hubbub, plenty of skeptics and other interested parties investigated the exorcism. Much of the recorded information that people referred to when discussing the series of events turned out to be hearsay, and there really is little evidence to prove any of it actually happened. In fact, it does seem like Roland suffered from some sort of mental illness, and writers thought it was a great story to exploit. Still, the treatment this boy received thanks to shaky claims of demonic possession is scary enough. Coming in at number 4, we've got the Exorcism of Michael Taylor. The year was 1974. Family man Michael Taylor lived with his wife and 5 kids in Ossett, an English market town near Wakefield. Most folks knew him as a relatively easygoing man, although he did suffer from depression linked to a back injury sustained years ago. The townsfolk were particularly religious, but the Taylors were not. This led a friend of the family to attempt to ease his pain through spirituality. She brought him to a church group and he became part of the religious community. Leading this group was a 21-year-old pastor by the name of Mary Robinson. As Michael spent more time with the fellowship, his wife, Christine, grew suspicious. Michael and Mary started spending lots of time together, engaging in activities like staying up all night and making the sign of the cross at each other to ward off evil. In fact, Michael's personality changed entirely. He adopted very strange beliefs and was bad-tempered around the house. Christine decided she'd had enough. She called him out in front of a large gathering of people, causing him to lash out. All in attendance claimed that something came over him as he screamed in tongues and flailed about. Eventually, he was restrained by a group of people and everyone decided it would be best if an exorcism was performed. 2 ministers were brought to Ossett to go through with it, and it ended up lasting overnight. Michael screamed and flailed and scratched and bit the whole time, prompting the ministers to tie him to the floor. They claimed that over 40 demons had possessed Michael and they weren't going to leave easily. In fact, the priests succumbed to exhaustion at 8 a.m. the next morning. They told Michael and Christine to head home and rest up for the final part of the exorcism, which in hindsight was a bad call. Now, whether or not demons actually infested Michael can never be proven, but what he did next definitely can be. A couple of hours after being sent home, Michael was found covered in blood. He had killed Christine as well as their pet dog. The entire living room was covered in blood and Christine's face had been ripped off. Michael had succumbed to something terrible and murdered his wife after his awful exorcism. Something tells me the church's intervention might not have helped poor Mike, and it definitely didn't help Christine.
Number 3 on this list is Rosetta Planker. Rosetta Planker was a young girl from the 1940s who became possessed by an evil demon. Her parents noticed that she started acting strange when her notebooks began filling up with demonic drawings, and her nice, innocent attitude vanished for dark depression out of nowhere. She started having issues at school, which was completely out of character for her, and the parents got to a point where they had to take her out. One day they found her in her room with her eyes rolled to the back of her head, stabbing one of her dolls repeatedly. It was at this point that they realized they had to get a professional in to perform an exorcism. They contacted their local pastor, who set them up with a weathered exorcist. This exorcist had seen his fair share of demonic possessions in his day, but even he wasn't prepared for what happened during Rosetta's exorcism. They laid Rosetta on the bed and strapped her in as they typically would. Then the exorcist began performing his ceremony, but it didn't take long for things to get out of hand. Rosetta began to float off of the bed, flailing her limbs as best as she could under the restraints. Her head started spinning around and around in a completely inhuman way, looking as if it was breaking her neck over and over and over again. She was screaming at this point, but it wasn't her voice or any voice that anyone present was familiar with, nor was the voice making any sense, just demonic gibberish nobody could understand. When her ascension reached as high as the restraints would allow, her chest kept going further up and further up, until finally her chest snapped open and blood exploded everywhere. A black ooze spouted onto her parents, and the exorcist sending them back and disorienting them. The exorcist was forced to stop as he was blown back and covered in this black ooze. When he wiped it off his face and opened his eyes, he saw the ugly remains of Rosetta laying on the bed. The demon had clung onto her soul so tightly that it refused to leave without taking her with it. I can't even possibly imagine what it would have been like to be in that room, or for the parents having to watch something like that. Number 2 on this list is Anneliese Michel. Anneliese Michel's exorcism story actually inspired the very popular horror film, The Exorcism of Emily Rose. What happened to Anneliese is certainly not pretty. She was a young German woman who was born in the 50s. All of her life she struggled with serious mental health issues. Depression, hallucinations, and bad psychosis were all side effects of these problems, which she actually had to be hospitalized for at some points. What was very strange was that her symptoms would often coincide with her being around religious acts or religious paraphernalia. This led her extremely religious parents and Anneliese herself to believe that she was possessed by a demon and needed it to be exorcised. She began having exorcisms performed to her when she was 22 years old, and they went on for 10 months. In those 10 months, she had a ridiculous amount of exorcisms performed on her, with the count reaching above 70. That is more than an exorcism a week that was happening to her. After these brutal 10 months though, Anneliese died. The cause of her death was a mixture of malnutrition, emaciation, and just pure starvation. The priests in charge of her exorcisms were taking extreme measures to get this demon out of her and abuse her body along the way. This case was brought to the court and it was proven that these priests were guilty of negligent homicide and had to serve jail time for her death. Similar to Kennedy, it was actually the exorcisms themselves and not the demon that took her life, which is pretty scary if you ask me. Number 1 on this list is the Panama exorcisms. Now I wish that I could describe exactly the ongoings of these exorcisms, but sadly we only have access to the aftermath of what transpired here. The Panama exorcisms happened in an indigenous jungle area of Panama and resulted in the murder of 7 people. The bodies of these 7 people included the likes of a pregnant woman, 5 of her children, and their neighbor. They were found in a mass grave and looked to be only the beginning of the murders if these murderous exorcisms hadn't been stopped when they were. That's because 15 other people were freed from captivity when the police raided the area. Apparently, an indigenous-run sect had been performing so-called exorcisms and murdering people if they hadn't fully repented for their sins. The prosecutor of this case is quoted saying they were performing a ritual inside the structure. In that ritual, there were people being held against their will, being mistreated. All of these rites were aimed at killing them if they didn't repent their sins. The place where they were performing these exorcisms was a church where they found a naked woman, machetes, and a ritually sacrificed goat amongst other religious paraphernalia. What this group did was kidnap people and then bring them here to perform what they thought was God's will. The leader of the group said that they had received a message from God and that's why they were doing this. This brutal atrocity only happened a little over a year ago as well, so it's still very fresh. I don't know exactly what happened in these exorcisms, but we do know that it resulted in the murder of 7 innocent people, which is just about as scary and sad as you can get.
Number 5. Amy Stamatis, 2006. Amy Stamatis was a nurse living in Searcy, Arkansas, and working at a hospital in the nearby town of Little Rock. The then 49-year-old was writing reports and suddenly realized that she had completely forgotten her training and could not remember any of the details of how to do her job. Not being able to continue in the field that she had dedicated her life to, she was forced to resign her post. Despite having been a jogger for years, she suddenly found herself unable to engage in that activity either. One by one, the things that brought her joy were suddenly becoming out of reach. Her mental condition worsened with incidents of her hearing voices, removing her clothes in public, suddenly screaming at loved ones, and climbing a 7-story parking ramp with the intention of leaping off of it. Although police officers managed to talk her down from this incident, the voices she was hearing continued to convince her to commit acts of self-harm, culminating in her jumping from the 2nd-story window of her house, resulting in her becoming paralyzed from the waist down. While she was recovering in the hospital, she received a visitor, a Pentecostal evangelist named Cindy Lawson, who claimed to have successfully performed 10 real exorcisms before, having witnessed people's eyes changing colors during the ritual, and even a few cases of levitation. Lawson claimed that God had spoken to her and told her to go to the hospital where she would find Amy, who was unknowingly possessed by demons. Stamatis agreed to let Lawson perform an exorcism, and though she has no memory of how the event went down, family members who were present claimed to see an instant change in Amy after it was complete. Number 4. The infamous Arnie Johnson case. 1981. In 1981, a young boy in Brookfield, Connecticut named David Glatzel began having vivid night terrors. As time went on, these nightmares began infiltrating his everyday life, with him seeing haunting figures such as an old man with a white beard, a man with big black eyes and animalistic features and jagged teeth. He then began engaging in bizarre behavior like kicking, biting, seizures, and marks of strangulation appearing out of nowhere. His family reached out to Ed and Lorraine Warren, who concluded that David was possessed by a demon. Priests performed 3 exorcisms on David, which supposedly caused him to levitate. In the chaos, the boyfriend of Debbie, David's older sister, Arnie Johnson, confronted the demon and told it to leave the child alone and to take him instead. David made a full recovery, but the demon decided to take Arnie up on his offer. A few months later, Arnie stabbed his landlord to death, and upon apprehension claimed that the devil made him do it. His trial marked the first time in history that someone entered a plea of not guilty for reasons of demonic possession, although this plea was rejected. David was charged with manslaughter and served 5 years of his 20-year sentence, and ended up marrying Debbie Glatzer. Their story was loosely adapted into the third Conjuring film, which follows Ed and Lorraine Warren's involvement with the case.
Coming in at number 3, we've got The Exorcism of Terence Cottrell. This is just terrible. In 2003, a young boy named Terence Cottrell was brought to a church by his mother. There was to be a prayer service for the young lad at the strip mall-based place of worship. Terence had autism, which his mother had decided was caused by evil spirits. The prayer service was intended to drive these spirits out of Terence's body and cure him of his condition. But it wasn't just prayer that these folks employed. Members of the congregation were to sit on Terence's limbs in order to ensure he stayed still, while the pastor, Ray Hemphill, sat on his chest and whispered to the demons. This went on for hours as Terence struggled, but eventually he gave in and suffocated. In the investigation that followed, it was discovered that Ray Hemphill had never received any formal religious training and was actually ordained by his brother. He was not qualified to be performing an exorcism, nor was he really ready to be leading services. What bothers me the most is how blindly the folks at the church followed his lead, allowing him to literally suffocate an 8-year-old boy. No charges were laid against the other people involved in the terrible ritual, as they all cited their Fifth Amendment right to refuse to testify in order to protect themselves. My goodness. Coming in at number 2, we've got The Exorcism of the Ammons Family. Most exorcisms involve one person possessed by multiple demons, right? Well, what about a whole family possessed by demons? Apparently this did indeed happen in Indianapolis. In 2011, LaToya Ammons and her family moved into a rental house along with LaToya's mother. Soon after they settled in, they noticed that an unnatural amount of black flies were swarming their porch. If that doesn't seem too weird to you, keep in mind that this was in December. They did their best to get rid of these pesky insects, but they just kept coming back. They would also hear footsteps throughout the house late at night and would often find doors swung open that they knew they'd left closed. One night, a dark figure was seen pacing in the living room, leaving wet boot prints behind. Things only got weirder from there. Late one night following the funeral of a loved one of Ammons' children levitated above her bed for all to see. After seeking help from a team of clairvoyants, the demonic possession got even worse. The children would don evil smiles, and their eyes would bulge as they discussed satanic things and conversed with people who weren't there. After one particularly bad incident ended up sending 2 of her boys to the hospital, medical staff witnessed the 9-year-old son walk backwards up a wall. All of this craziness led to the Department of Child Services getting involved, and the children were taken into custody. This prompted Ammons to take more decisive action. She brought in a priest who sought official permission to perform an exorcism. Bishop Dale Melchick was reluctant, but Reverend Michael Maganot sought help from other priests who had performed exorcisms. Eventually the house was cleansed of demonic presence, but not before Ammons was put through hell. The story does have a happy ending though, as 6 months after her children were taken into DCS custody, LaToya was able to welcome them back home. Honestly, this is a very interesting read, so go check out the whole story in the description. And finally, at number 1, we've got Annalise Mitchell. We started with the basis for an exorcism movie and will end with the basis for an exorcism movie. Annalise's story was eventually turned into The Exorcism of Emily Rose. Originally, it was a tale from Germany. When Annalise was 16, she was diagnosed with psychosis caused by temporal lobe epilepsy. However, being a devout churchgoer, she and her family were convinced that she was possessed by a demon. They did try to help her condition using medications, but after 5 years with no improvement, they were desperate for results. The family appealed to the Catholic Church, which reluctantly sent 2 priests to attempt to exorcise the young woman. When the exorcisms began, the parents stopped consulting doctors. These events, in conjunction with each other, led to the untimely death of Annalise. 67 exorcism sessions were performed, during which Annalise refused food and water. She succumbed to malnourishment and dehydration. Her parents, as well as the priests, were found guilty of negligent homicide for their actions. My word. So what's scarier, demons or people? Hard to tell after hearing all these stories.
Coming in at number 5, we have Clara Germaina Selly. Back in 1906, Clara was a young South African Christian who was said to have been possessed by a demon at the age of just 16 years old. Clara was a student at St. Michael's Mission in natal South Africa during this time, and it was at the age of 16 that she was said to have made a pact with Satan, which resulted in demonic possession, supposedly. In an account written by a nun, it was said that Clara could speak many languages that she wasn't capable of speaking prior to her possession. She was also reported to exhibit clairvoyance, with her revealing secrets and transgressions of people she had never met. It was also reported that Clara could not be in the presence of holy or blessed objects. classic sign of possession, and when she was, she would seem to exhibit extraordinary strength and ferocity. And even stated that Clara would make peculiar sounds, stating, I quote, "No animal ever made such sounds, neither the lions of East Africa nor the angry bulls. At times it sounded like a veritable herd of wild beasts, orchestrated by Satan, and formed a hellish choir." 2 priests went on to perform an exorcism on Clara, with it lasting approximately 2 days. During the exorcism, it was said that Clara knocked the Bible out of the priest's hands and even attempted to choke him. By the end of those 2 days, it was said that the demon was expelled from the girl and that she was healed. Happy days. Before we jump into number 4, be sure to give this video a big thumbs up. It really helps us out a lot in the YouTube algorithm. Coming in at number 4, we have Anna Eklund. Anna Eklund is actually a pseudonym for Emma Schmidt, a woman who was allegedly possessed by a demon, with exorcisms occurring over several decades, resulting in one extensive exorcism that took place between August 18th to December 23rd of 1928. Schmidt was born in Switzerland and was raised in a Catholic household in Wisconsin, and on June 18th of 1912, she underwent her first exorcism. After exhibiting signs of possession, including revulsion of holy objects, disturbed thoughts, and inability to enter churches. Now, despite the first exorcism taking place, it appeared to be unsuccessful, with the second exorcism being performed in 1928, with Eklund being moved to a convent after once again exhibiting strange symptoms, including fits of rage and the inability to be near blessed objects. The second exorcism was reported to be incredibly violent, with Eklund even levitating and howling during it. The first session lasted until August 26th, with the second session occurring between September 13th to September 20th, followed by a final 8-day session that lasted from December 15th to December 23rd. Eklund's body began to deteriorate during this time due to lack of food and constant vomiting. On December 23rd, Father Risinger commanded the demons out of Eklund and seemingly cured her of her possession.
Number 3. Roland Doe, 1949. In 1949, a young boy was mourning the loss of his aunt, who had been a deeply committed spiritualist who had taught the child how to use a Ouija board so that he could converse with spirits. The boy, whose name was changed to Roland Doe in the reports of the incident to preserve his anonymity, soon began hearing strange scratching noises coming from inside his bedroom walls and having issues with his mattress vigorously shaking on its own. His parents took him to medical professionals who could find nothing wrong with the boy. When the family minister also failed to find anything, the boy's parents enlisted Father E. Albert Hughes, who received permission from the church to perform an exorcism on Roland. This attempt didn't end up working out, as Roland tore a spring out of his mattress during the ritual and slashed the priest across the shoulders. Upon inspection of Roland, his mother discovered that the word Louis had been scratched onto his flesh. She took this as a sign to go to St. Louis, where she met Father Walter H. Halloran and the Reverend William Bowdern. They attempted nightly exorcisms on the boy, during which the child was sent into a rage at the sight of a crucifix, caused the bed to rattle, and made items fly across the room. The clergymen found a large X scratched on Roland, which caused them to conclude that he was possessed by 10 different demons. On the 21st attempt, Roland gained control of himself, claiming that the spirits were gone, and that he had had visions of St. Michael fighting and defeating the devil on his behalf. Roland never suffered any further incidents of demonic interference again, but the story of his ordeal inspired the novel The Exorcist, which was adapted into the classic horror film of the same name. Number 2. Gottleibenditis, 1842. Our next entry takes us to the German village of Mottlingen in 1842. Residents of this sleepy village started to notice strange noises and odd goings-on at the home of a 28-year-old woman named Gottleibenditis, who believed that her house was being haunted by the ghost of a woman who was always seen carrying a baby in her arms. Ditis began being affected and would drift in and out of a trance-like state, seemingly blacking out for days at a time. The local pastor, Johann Christoph Blumhardt, took it upon himself to free Ditis of her affliction, which had lasted for 2 whole years before he got involved. He claimed that Ditis was possessed by several demons, as well as the spirit of the woman that she had reported seeing, who Blumhardt believed to be the ghost of a local murderous widow who had been known for burying children in a nearby field. The exorcisms he performed on Ditis were horrific, with her reportedly vomiting blood, broken glass, and even nails. The exorcisms continued until one day Didas appeared to snap out of her possession, declaring that all the demons and spirits had been cast out and that Jesus was the victor. Number 1. Clara Seal, 1906. In one of the first documented exorcisms in South Africa, a 16-year-old orphan named Clara Germana Seal was staying at the Marion Hill Mission School in Umzinto when she began exhibiting violent behavior. The behavior became more and more extreme until one day the teen began growling, tearing at her clothes, and demanding to speak with the local priest, Father Erasmus Horner. Clara confessed to the priest that she had made a deal with the devil himself, and when the nuns tried to pour holy water on her, her skin began to burn. She would go wild and convulse at the sight of religious iconography, showed immense strength disproportionate to her size, and she began speaking languages that the young teen could not possibly know. When Clara began levitating in front of them, the priest and the nuns got permission to perform an exorcism on her. The exorcism was a wild ordeal, with Clara trying to strangle the priests, levitating at various times, and in perhaps the most horrifying and amazing moment of the ritual, transforming into a serpent who bit one of the nuns. The exorcism lasted for 2 full days and was performed in front of 170 people. By the end of the second day, the demon reportedly caused Clara to levitate one last time before leaving her body, never to return. Clara was demon-free, but unfortunately died 6 years later of heart failure at the age of 22.
Number 5 on this list is the exorcism of Emma Schmidt. Emma Schmidt's exorcism was a widely publicized affair that happened in 1928. What's interesting about this case is that Emma Schmidt had actually been the subject of an exorcism from the same exorcist in 1912. Father Riesinger was the one who performed the exorcism in 1912, and when he heard about how she'd become possessed again, he rushed to help her. However, this time he didn't expect the demon to have as strong as a hold on her soul as it did. Now, it's written that after Father Riesinger began to perform the exorcism, Emma dislodged herself from her bed and from the hands of her guards, and her body, carried through the air, landed high above the door of the room and clung to the wall with a tenacious grip. All present were struck with a trembling fear. The nuns who were present and assisting reportedly grabbed her and strapped her back down to the bed, even though she was screaming and squirming in unnatural ways. It's said that this exorcism required 23 days to complete, and during that time, Emma would regularly be vomiting up bile and fighting as much as she could to stop it from happening. It's even said that Lucifer appeared during this exorcism and made his presence known by attacking the exorcist at one point. Emma also had super strength and was able to bend the iron bars on her bed, even though she was extremely malnourished at that point. Father Riesinger was mentally drained and exhausted after the 23 days of performing that exorcism and claims that he had never seen anything like that in his time on Earth. Number 4 on this list is the movie The Exorcist. Now, The Exorcist is one of the most famous horror films of all time and is sometimes credited as being the scariest movie of the genre. Now, the movie The Exorcist is actually based off of a real-life exorcism that took place in the 1940s. This was an exorcism of a 14-year-old boy documented under the pseudonym Roland Doe. Supernatural events took place during this exorcism, which then inspired the creation of the film several decades later. Rather than look at the actual exorcisms here though, I actually want to look at the creation of the movie The Exorcist, because there's actually a curse that surrounds it. Jack McGowan, the man who plays the film director in the movie, died before the film actually hit the big screens. He died due to influenza that he got in 1973. Vasiliki Malaros, who also acted in the movie, died before the movie was seen by anyone. Many people who were involved in filming of the movie lost their family members whilst the movie was in production. There was also a report of another one of the actors almost dying in a near-fatal motorcycle crash. This was all coupled with the fact that in the early production of the movie, the entire set caught fire because a bird flew into the circuit box. There were several other crazy mishaps that went on during the filming of this movie, along with the actual premiere, which was then hit with a lot of controversy. All of this has led people to believe that there is actually a curse tied to the movie and the entire production of it. Some believe that the demon from the initial exorcism in the 1940s came back to incite some chaos on the team recreating the story. Whatever the case was, it's certainly pretty crazy that one of the scariest movies of all time had one of the most controversial and scary filming processes of all time as well.
In third place, we have John Jenkin, who also happens to be the most recent case on this list. In the summer of 2013, 25-year-old John from Cumbria, England, expressed fears that he would kill his mother. If it was just a fear, you can't relate some days. Well, in his deranged state, he approached a random van driver, put his hands in the air in a surrender motion, and cried out, "I am armed, but it's not in my hands." Desperate to avoid committing such an atrocity, John tried to end his life by downing a cocktail of whiskey, painkillers, LSD, and attempting to end himself in a river. He was discovered later that day, unstable, and smeared with his own red fluid after self-inflicting. After these events, John was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, where staff judged him as low risk and released him. I'm no expert, but I'd hate to see high risk if that's considered, minimal? Later that evening, he confessed to a group of friends that he was possessed by demons, stating, "I am the devil, I need to confess." He said his mother had become aggressive and controlling after the events of that day. And that same night, his sister Katie had confided in one of her own friends that she was really worried about her brother, saying that he didn't seem like her brother and he didn't look like her brother anymore. The next morning, after a brutal argument with his mother and sister, he went downstairs and hit his mother with lots of blows to her head with a sharp end of an axe, and when his sister came downstairs, he attacked her as well to stop her from screaming. I guess the sister was sadly right to be worried. Now, after the killings, John was found stark naked, crouched behind a bench, acting erratically. When a police officer asked him if he had taken anything, he simply replied, "Lives." A court has since sentenced him to a minimum of only 12 years in prison. In second place, time to meet Michael Taylor. In the 1970s, Michael Taylor was largely an ordinary figure in the town of Ossett, Yorkshire. He, his wife Christine, their 5 children, and their pet poodle lived peaceful and happy lives. And now to, pop that Stepford Wives bubble. In 1974, Christine stated to a Christian fellowship group to which they both belonged that his relationship with the leader of the group, Marie Robinson, was carnal in nature. Michael admitted that he felt evil within him and eventually attacked Marie verbally, who screamed back at him. Marie stated that his eyes changed to something bestial and that he began to speak in tongues. Michael had no memory of the event, something all too common in cases of possession. During the next meeting, he received an absolution, but his behavior continued to become more erratic. As a result, the local vicar called in other ministers experienced in deliverance in preparation to cast out the demons residing within the man. The exorcism, which occurred between the 5th and the 6th of October 1974 at St. Thomas's Church in Gauber, was led by Father Peter Vincent, the Anglican priest of St. Thomas's, and was aided by a Methodist clergyman, the Reverend Raymond Smith. Over the next 8 hours, Michael would repeatedly have crucifixes stuffed inside of his mouth while being doused with holy water. Okay, now my jaw hurts. According to Bill Ellis, an authority on folklore and the occult in contemporary culture, the exorcists believed that they had, in this all-night ceremony, invoked and cast out at least 40 demons, including those of incest, bestiality, blasphemy, and lewdness. In the end, exhausted, they allowed Taylor to go home, although they felt that at least 3 demons were still left in him. While at home, he brutally ended his wife, Christine, by attacking her with his bare hands, tearing her eyes and tongue out, and almost tearing her face off. He was eventually found by a policeman, completely naked in the street and covered in red fluid. At his trial in March, he was acquitted on the grounds of insanity. He was sent to Broadmoor Hospital for 2 years, then spent another 2 years in a secure ward in Bradford before being released. I'm seeing some repeating factors here, are you? Finally, in first place, we have Arne Cheyenne Johnson, otherwise known as the Devil Made Me Do It. Now, before I talk about his exact crime, we have to explain how he came to be possessed. Satan originally possessed David Glatzel, the 11-year-old brother of his fiancée, who was living with the couple. Strange happenings first began in the summer, when young David would jolt awake in the middle of the night, sobbing in fear after being visited by a hideous creature that he described as a man with big black eyes, a thin face with animal features, jagged teeth, pointed ears, horns, and hooves. The beastly apparition had issued a warning. Beware. Very quickly, the visions amplified, with David's beast now haunting him during the daytime. Each time the child experienced a visitation, deep scratches would appear on the front door of the family's home, and red marks would appear on David's body. Thankfully, everyone in the household believed his claims. According to his sister Debbie, it was out of character for him to lie, describing that he never liked anything spooky, not even scary comic books. Becoming increasingly worried for young David, a priest was summoned to bless the house, but that accomplished a big fat nada. The possession had escalated to such heights that the family were now taking shifts to monitor him during the night. Eventually, the involvement of paranormal investigators, some of my favorite people to discuss on this channel, Ed and Lorraine Warren, was begged for, and luckily for the family, they were available. With her strong powers of clairvoyance, Lorraine described encountering a black misty form during her first meeting with David, knowing immediately she and Ed were dealing with something of a negative nature. Lorraine has stated over the course of several visits, David made numerous references to ending and stabbings. In an attempt to save David from his endless tormentors, Arn taunted the demons during exorcisms to enter his body and leave the boy alone. And sadly, the challenge was accepted. Look, I'm all for saving kiddos, but there's a limit. You don't want to actually invite the demons into your body. Over many months after that fateful day, Arn's fiancée reported that he would go into a trance, where he would growl and say he saw the beast, and later would have no memory of it. It was 6 months later, on the 16th of February, 1981, shortly after 6 p.m., that Arn brutally attacked his landlord, stabbing him in a frenzy as he growled like a beast, while Debbie watched, unable to react. The landlord passed away later that evening. At his trial, Arn pleaded not guilty to the ending charge, with his defense being the demonic entity which inhibited his body had caused him to do it. In fifth place, we have the case of Anneliese Michel. She grew up practicing Christianity in Bavaria, West Germany in the 1960s, where she attended Mass twice a week. When Anneliese was only 16, she suddenly blacked out at school and began walking around in what her friends and family described as a trance-like state, and she herself was unable to recall any of it. A year later, Anneliese experienced a similar occurrence where she woke up in a trance after her body went through a series of convulsions, causing it to shake uncontrollably. After this, Anneliese visited a neurologist who diagnosed her with temporal lobe epilepsy, a disorder that causes seizures, loss of memory, and experiencing visual and auditory hallucinations. After her diagnosis, Anneliese began taking medication for her epilepsy and enrolled in the University of Würzburg in 1973. Now, if that medication was successful, I wouldn't be talking about her right now, would I? The medication she was given failed to help her, and as the year progressed, her condition deteriorated. She began to see the face of the devil wherever she went, and constantly heard demons whispering in her ears. When she heard the demons telling her she was damned and would rot in hell while she was praying, she concluded that the devil himself must be possessing her. Anneliese sought out priests to help her with her demonic possession, but all the clergy she approached rejected her requests, saying that she should seek medical help and that they would need the permission of a bishop to do anything. Now at this point, Anneliese's state had become extreme. With the knowledge that she was possessed consuming her, she constantly ripped the clothes off her body, compulsively performed up to 400 squats a day, crawled under a table, and barked like a dog for 2 days. Hey, who needs a gym, right? She also ate spiders and coal, bit the head off a dead bird, and licked her own fluids from the floor. Oh, I'm not queasy, why do you ask? Finally, she and her mother found a priest, Ernst Alt, who believed in her possession, stating that she didn't look like an epileptic. If I'm taking this with a grain of salt, I'd like to know what his definition of an epileptic looks like. Anneliese wrote to Ernst, "I am nothing, everything about me is vanity. What should I do? I have to improve. You pray for me. I want to suffer for other people, but this is so cruel." Ernst petitioned the local bishop, Bishop Joseph Stang, who eventually approved the request and granted local priest Arnold Renz the permission to perform an exorcism, but ordered that it be carried out in total secrecy. Now, being granted an exorcism in the 70s was like winning the lottery. They were very rarely granted due to the sensationalism caused by the release of The Exorcist, and the Catholic Church was determined to protect their reputation. Reputation at the time. Fine, reputation on exorcisms at the time. I know, it's the church. Over the next 10 months, following the bishop's approval of Anneliese's exorcism, Ernst and Arnold conducted 67 exorcisms, lasting up to 4 hours per session on the poor woman. Absolutely heinous. Through these sessions, Anneliese revealed that she was possessed by 6 demons, Lucifer, Cain, and Nero, amongst others. And that just there was how I learned that Nero was more than just a former Jeff Hardy gimmick. Weird middle name to give a kid. All these spirits would jostle for control of Anneliese's body and would communicate from her mouth with a low growl. The demons constantly argued with each other, with one being quoted as saying, "People are stupid as pigs. They think it's all over after death. It goes on." And another replying that the first was nothing but a big mouth who had no real say in hell. Throughout these sessions, Anneliese would frequently talk about dying to make up for the wayward youth of the day and apostate priests of the modern church. She broke the bones and ripped the tendons in her knees from continually kneeling in prayer, and I just felt that statement in my own ballet-worn knees. Ouch. Over these 10 months, Annalise was frequently restrained so the priest could conduct exorcism rites. She slowly stopped eating and eventually passed from malnutrition and dehydration on July 1st, 1976, at only 23 years old. In fourth place, we have the nuns of Loudun and Louviers. Louviers? My French is 50-50 right now. Time to hop in my little time machine and head back to 1642, when 18 nuns became possessed. Father Mathurin Picard, the nunnery director, and Father Thomas Boule, the vicar at Louviers, were convicted on the evidence of the possessed nuns' recounts. The youngest of the group, being only 18 years old at the time, Sister Madeleine Bavin, was the initial possession victim. Her testimony was successful in throwing the church into a state of panic, alleging that Fathers Picard and Boule had taken the nuns to secret sabbats. At these gatherings, they became familiar with numerous demons, specifically including the demon Damon. Try saying that without tripping over your tongue. Nah. Testimonies quickly followed from the other nuns, reinforcing Madeleine's claims, and after further investigation from the church and its authorities, it was discovered that the nuns were suffering from the classic symptoms of possession. The exorcism rites that followed were made public, enabling the entire town of Louviers to become totally engrossed in the church and its proceedings. After the exorcisms, Madeleine was imprisoned for life, Father Boule was burned at the stake, and the corpse of Father Picard, who had already passed, was exhumed and burned. Moving into the 17th century, in the French village of Loudun, an entire convent of Ursuline nuns were possessed by a series of demons with names such as Leviathan, Astaroth, and Zabulon. These nuns appeared during a series of trials that accused the parish priest, Urbain Grandier, of having made a pact with Satan. Photos of the signed pact still exist, with autographs from the devil and the previous mentioned demons possessing the nuns. In a series of public trials and exorcisms, these nuns barked, screamed, convulsed, and spoke in devil language. These sights led to a public hysteria that ultimately ended in Urbain being burnt at the stake. The events of the Loudun possessions were turned into a book by Aldous Huxley called The Devils of Loudun in 1952, which was then adapted as the 1971 film The Devils. Anyone want to have a movie night?
Coming in at number 3, we have Michael Taylor. Born in 1944, Michael Taylor was a man from the UK. He became notable after he alleged that he was possessed by a demon. Taylor reported feeling evil inside of himself, even verbally lashing out during a Christian fellowship group. His behavior continued to become more erratic, with a local vicar turning to other ministers to call out the demon that was supposedly living inside of Taylor. An exorcism took place between October 5th to 6th, with the ministers believing that after an all-night session they had cast the demons out of Taylor. However, they did state that 3 remained: insanity, murder, and violence. However, Taylor was allowed to go home. When he did return home, though, he brutally murdered his wife, and he was found by local police naked in the street and covered in his own blood. At his trial, Taylor was acquitted on grounds of insanity and was sent to Broadmoor Hospital for 2 years before being sent to a secure ward in Bradford, before ultimately being released. Jumping forward to 2005, Taylor was once again in the news after touching someone inappropriately, resulting in him once again being ordered in psychiatric treatment. Seems less like the devil and more like a deranged human being who should not be allowed to live amongst society. In my opinion, that is. Coming in at number 2, we have Anneliese Michel. Anneliese, often referred to simply as Anna, was a German woman who was said to have undergone roughly 67 Catholic exorcisms during the year prior to her death. When Anna was 16 years old, she began to experience seizures and was ultimately diagnosed with psychosis caused by temporal lobe epilepsy. Not long after that, she was diagnosed with depression and was treated at a hospital. However, by the time Anna turned 18, she began to exhibit violent tendencies. She began hearing voices and was intolerant of religious objects that were around her family's home. Her condition continued to worsen, resulting in her family believing that she was possessed by a demon. The family ultimately turned to the Catholic Church for help, with priests being approved to conduct a series of exorcisms on the girl, with the family halting any communication with doctors altogether. During the ordeal, Anna began to stop eating and ultimately passed away from malnourishment and dehydration following 67 grueling exorcism sessions. The girl's parents and the 2 Roman Catholic priests were found guilty of negligent homicide and spent 6 months in prison for their crimes. There are many popular horror movies that took inspiration from this case, including The Exorcism of Emily Rose, as well as Annalise the Exorcist tapes. And finally, in at number 1, we have Roland Doe. Now, this case claims our number 1 spot, and rightfully so, with this true possession case being the story to inspire the movie The Exorcist. Back in the late 40s, a young boy dubbed Roland Doe was alleged to be possessed by a demonic entity, with priests from the Roman Catholic Church performing a series of exorcisms to attempt to expel the demons residing within. Roland Doe was said to be a German Lutheran, with him and his family residing in Cottage City in Maryland. However, according to reports, on one particular occasion his spiritual aunt allowed him to play with a Ouija board, which may have resulted in his supposed possession. According to reports following the death of Roland Doe's aunt, the family began to experience strange goings-on within the home. Noises, furniture moving on its own accord, and ordinary objects levitating. The family ultimately turned to their pastor, Miles Schultz, with him arranging for Roland Doe to spend a night in his home to monitor the boy. Schultz claimed to witness those same goings-on within his home when the boy was there. An exorcism was arranged, with documents from that exorcism stating how the boy slipped his hand loose from his restraints and managed to break a bed spring from under his mattress, using it as a weapon to attack the priests. During another exorcism on the boy, it was reported that words such as evil and hell appeared on Roland Doe's body, with the mattress beginning to shake during the ritual. Despite the terrifying goings-on after the rite was over, it was said that Roland Doe went on to lead a rather ordinary life. However, like I said, this case shocked the world after William Peter Blatty chose to use elements from the events in his novel The Exorcist back in 1971, with the famous story going on to be one of the most successful and famous movies of all time.
Number 5 on this list is The Exorcism of Dan Abudani. Dan was a young adult living in Malaysia who ran a local business that he inherited from his father. He sold textiles and did okay for himself, certainly not getting rich, but also not being dirt poor either. For reasons unbeknownst to him, Dan started to notice some strange ongoings at his store. He had been running it for roughly a year, and all of a sudden, strange things started to happen. The lights, which were brand new, would flicker uncontrollably and then just as quickly stop as if nothing happened. The register would sometimes just open without warning, as if some ghost thief was trying to rob Dan. A harsh wind would blow his textiles when there was no window or door open for wind to blow through. Dan was never somebody to believe in the paranormal or anything like that, but his late father was, and he remembered him telling him a legend of a family who was killed on this area of land prior to them erecting their textile company. After some months of these ongoings, he finally decided to get in contact with somebody who knew something about the supernatural, and they recommended getting an exorcism done. Dan was reluctant at first, but finally caved and had an exorcist brought in to see if they could do anything. After examining the space, the exorcist insisted that not only a ritual be performed on the storefront, but also one be performed on Dan to make sure that no demon was clinging on to anything in the space. If Dan was going to go down this route, then he had better do what they tell him, so he agreed. He was strapped down to a chair in the back of the store, and the exorcist began performing their ritual. At first nothing happened, but then the wind started to pick up, the lights started to flicker, and the register began operating as if it had a mind of its own. A deep shadow filled the room, and even though the lights were on, it felt like darkness was overpowering them. The exorcist was chanting his ritual as loudly as he could at this point, trying with all of his ability to exorcise whatever was occupying the space. Just as it felt like he might be making progress, a deep voice boomed throughout the space and said, "Leave my home." Just as that finished, a pair of scissors that was lying on one of Dan's workbenches flew from where it was and pierced the exorcist directly in his neck. He fell to the ground and life slowly left his body, with Dan strapped to the chair, unable to help him. Dan was found in his store 2 days later by a neighbor, extremely dehydrated and close to death. He told the police what I told you, but they didn't believe him, and he went to jail for murder. A really sad story of a young guy who just happened to own the wrong store at the wrong time. Number 4 on this list is the most famous case from the notable exorcist, Father Vincenzo Taraborelli. Father Vincenzo Taraborelli is one of the most known exorcists in the world. He's stationed in Rome and well into his 80s at this point. The Catholic Church has been attempting to find a successor for his role, but no priest wants to take on the deep mental strain that it will cause them. Now, it's said that Father Vincenzo Taraborelli will see up to 30 people in one day. He often urges someone who intends to become an exorcist to regularly see a psychologist, as the job is incredibly draining. The exorcism that we're going to look at from him today is one case that has actually spanned over 13 years. The woman was deeply possessed, and it took over a decade for Father Vincenzo to eventually oust the demon. He spoke about the ongoings of these exorcisms in an interview back in 2016, and he will do a far better job explaining the situation than me. So I quote, "Another man who was a Satanist wanted her. She refused, so this man told her, 'You'll pay for this.' He cast so-called spells to attract her to him twice a week. Then they came to me in this room. I started to pray, and she went into a trance. She would blurt out insults, blasphemies. I quickly understood she was possessed. As the rite continued, she started feeling worse and worse. So when I told the devil, 'In the name of Jesus, I order you to go away,' she started to vomit little metal pins, 5 at a time. Aside from pins, she would also vomit hair braids, little stones, pieces of wood. It sounds like something from another world, right? Instead, it's something from this world. End quote. That last sentence really gets to me. It sounds like something from another world, but instead it's something from this world. And that's exactly what I thought when I first heard this story. How on earth is it possibly real for someone to vomit up little stones or pieces of wood? Frankly, I would be petrified if I saw someone doing that, and I completely understand why Father Vincenzo recommends seeing a psychologist before you take on this role. Number 3 on this list is the exorcism of Terence Cottrell. Terence Cottrell's exorcism is a sad story of a little boy who lived in Milwaukee in 2003. Terence, in his mother's eyes, had been possessed by a demon, and she believed that it needed to be exorcised from him. This wasn't the case though. In fact, it seemed that Terence had actually been diagnosed with autism. However, the mother refused to believe this was the case and instead convinced herself that he was possessed. In 2003, she drove her boy to a strip mall in Milwaukee where there was the Faith Temple Church of the Apostolic Faith. A bunch of evangelical Christians gathered here and they had agreed to perform an exorcism on Terence and get rid of this so-called demon once and for all. Sadly, this isn't what happened at all, and as I imagine many of you can expect, Terence was killed during the ritual. Once he arrived at the church, a sheet was thrown over top of him and it bound his arms and legs. The pastor, Reverend Ray Hemphill, who was performing the exorcism, lay the boy down with the sheet over top of him and then lay on top of him himself, whispering his ritual into the child's ear. This went on for over 2 hours until the Reverend and the group realized that Terence had died. The official cause of death was listed as mechanical asphyxia due to external chest compression. The pastor had lied on Terence for too long and his weight basically crushed his chest. This, along with the fact that he'd been wrapped in a sheet, which would have made it difficult to breathe anyways, caused the boy to suffocate. This case was obviously brought to the court of law, and it was revealed that our so-called exorcist was never properly trained on the subject at all. He went to jail for 2.5 years and was barred from performing exorcisms unless he received extensive training on how to do them in the future. Number 2 on this list is an exorcism performed by Father Gabriel Amorth. Father Gabriel Amorth lived for almost a century and performed over 60,000 exorcisms in his long life. He's seen his fair share of demons and possessions, but one story in 1997 sticks out to him as being particularly bad. He co-wrote a book called The Devil is Afraid of Me, where he details his extensive history with exorcisms, so if this is interesting to you, then I recommend checking that out. In that book, they describe this particular exorcism in detail, stating that his curses and threats were aimed solely at the exorcist. Then he began spitting at him and preparing to attack him physically. The book goes on to say that screaming and howling, the demon burst forth and looked straight at him, drooling saliva from the young man's mouth. This was all being conducted on a young man who had apparently been the victim of a demonic possession for months, and it was happening in Amorth's small exorcism room in Rome. Amorth says that after the demon revealed itself, he screamed back, "Whoever you are and all your companions who possess the servant of God, as I command you, tell me your name, the day and the hour of your damnation." To which the demon replied, "I am Lucifer." The room then became icy cold and crystals started to appear on the windows. The young boy began to float in his chair, and actual real-life nails that Amorth still has to this day started to form in this person's mouth. Amorth was bellowing the word of God at this point, and the demonic boy was shrieking at the top of his lungs. Finally, the boy fell to the ground and looked completely spent. This was only the first exorcism performed on this boy, and to fully exorcise the demon, it took Amorth several more months of sessions like this. But up until the day he died, he swore he never saw a demon that had that strong of a hold on somebody's soul. Number 1 on this list is the exorcism of Ryan Eastaugh. Ryan lived back in the 1200s in Ireland. He worked as a fisherman and supported his newlywed wife. Ryan worked with another older fisherman named Hugh, and Hugh had basically taught Ryan everything that he knew. In fact, when Ryan was younger, he was an orphan, and being completely homeless would have to steal to survive. One day, Hugh caught Ryan stealing from him, and rather than get the law involved, decided that he would take Ryan under his wing. That was over a decade ago, and even though Hugh wasn't blood related to Ryan in any way, he may as well have been based on the relationship that the two had developed. One evening, the pair were out on the water longer than they had intended, and a storm whipped up. The men were trying to sail back to shore, but the winds were harsh and unforgiving. With one swift gust, the boat was rocked hard and Hugh was thrown into the waves. Ryan ran to the side of the boat and saw as Hugh struggled to stay above water, but rather than help him by throwing him something or diving in himself, Ryan froze and just stood there. He stood there, planted, indecisive about what to do, and slowly, Hugh drowned right before Ryan's eyes. Ryan managed to weather the storm, and once it subsided, got the boat back to shore, but he was never the same after that. His mood grew dark, his outlook on life was gloomy, and his temper would often rage. His wife, who was now pregnant with his child, feared the worst, believing that Ryan may have become possessed with a demon. Without Ryan's knowledge, she got in contact with an exorcist and had him wait at their home for when her husband would get back. He came home late the night that the exorcist was there, and it was clear that he'd been drinking. He found his wife sitting there with the man, and upon hearing her explanation of the scenario, grew furious. The exorcist saw this deep anger and took it to mean that the demon was coming out and possessing Ryan. As Ryan's anger grew, the exorcist pulled out his cross and started chanting some deep incantation to keep the demon at bay. He barely got through the first few lines though, when Ryan grabbed a nearby bottle and struck the exorcist across the head. The man hit the ground and blood pooled from that large indent that was now sliced across his forehead. He was dead, and Ryan had murdered him. Immediately the fury was replaced with regret, and Ryan dropped to his knees. Sadly, it was too late though. The deed was done and he was sentenced to death shortly afterwards. Whether Ryan was actually possessed by a demon or not, that's unknown. I personally think the only demons that he was ever possessed with are the demons that he imposed onto himself for never acting when his father figure, Hugh, drowned in front of his eyes.